How do plants adapt to areas? Do those adaptations change plants? Do plants get to make decisions about this? So, how do plants adapt? Most of the time, what we're talking about is long term adaptation over many, many generations. Their DNA can evolve, meaning that if a plant is in a wet site long enough and its progeny are a little bit more adapted to the wet site, and their progeny are a little bit more adapted to the wet site, over multiple generations, that DNA is a little bit changed so that they now require a wet site. You can have a mutation that allows the plant to live. You can have sexual reproduction that adds variety. Every time you have sexual reproduction, you have so many different combinations that can possibly be made. Sometimes the environment changes. You have a flood, or a very wet season, or multiple wet seasons, or a crack appears, or something like that. And this can cause diversification of species, meaning you can generate more species if you're trying to do that. If we watch this little video.
The building was basically a petri dish. Except that it's 2 feet by 4 feet. And the way we set it up is that there are 9 bands, and at the base of each of these bands, we put a normal petri dish thick agar with different amounts of antibiotic. On the outside, there's no antibiotic. Just in from that, there's barely more than the E. coli can survive. Inside of that, there's 10 times as much, 100 times, and then finally the middle band has 1,000 times as much antibiotic. And then across the top of it pours thin agar that bacteria can move around in. The background is black because there's ink in it, and the bacteria appear as white. First, you see they spread in the area where there's no antibiotic, up until the point they can no longer survive. Then a mutant appears on the right. It's resistant to the antibiotic, it spreads, until it starts to compete with other mutants around it. When these mutants hit the next boundary, they too have to pause and develop new mutations to make it into 10 times as much antibiotic. And then you see the different mutants repeat this at 100. And after about 11 days, they finally make it into 1,000 times as much antibiotic as the wild type can survive. And so we can see by this process of accumulating successive mutations that bacteria, which are normally sensitive to an antibiotic, can evolve resistance to extremely high concentrations in a short period of time.
That video shows the adaptation. Every single one of those mutations potentially could be a different species if those organisms did not have the ability to reproduce sexually with any of the other types of mutations. And so that's one example of diversification of species. So some basic terms: a population is a set of individuals of a species living in any area that have to be able to reproduce. So you could have a population of pine trees in a forest, or of ferns in that forest, and even though you might have in the next state over the same species of pine tree, they're not part of that population, because the pine trees in, let's say, I don't know, Idaho, cannot reproduce with the pine trees that are living here in Ohio. So they may be the same species, but they're not part of the same population. Then we have the sciences of population genetics, and that is a study of how these different alleles increase or decrease or stay constant in a population, and what's going on in the environment that might drive those changes. A gene pool is nothing more than the total alleles of all individuals in a given population. So if you were talking about the population of people in the United States, the gene pool for the all humans is all of our genes. So if we look at this, look at these trees, what you'll see is lots and lots of different, mostly pine trees. Any one that's the same species are all part of that population, because they are capable of possibly reproducing with any other of the same species in that particular area. Now look closely at this image. You will notice that the plants on the left side of the mountain and the plants on the right side of the mountain are very different. It's due to different environments. So if you had a species of plant that happened to live on both sides, it's possible that the environment on one side could cause a species to change to the point where it really no longer can reproduce with the same species on the other side. And now they're no longer the same species. They are technically two separate species. And that's an example of speciation. The gene pool can change. You can have genetic drift, which is an event that an organism absolutely cannot adapt to. So if we have a hurricane that isolates a population by itself, if we have a mountain range that shows up that can isolate populations on either side of the mountain, you could have a flood or a volcano or lots and lots of natural disasters. Versus artificial selection, which is what we do. That's human intervention, where we are specifically breeding for certain characteristics. So here's an example of gene pool changes. On the right-hand side is the wild type violet, a wild violet. On the left-hand side is a modern pansy. The modern pansy was bred from that wild type violet, but they are now separate species because the pansy can no longer breed with the wild type. This causes some challenges, especially when it comes to plant material, especially when it comes to zoos, because all zoos have these species survival plans so that you don't have genetic inbreeding. We tend to think of our gardens as unchanging, which isn't true, but it's really easy to see the problems that happen with zoos. If you paid any attention to zoos in the last couple of years, you will know that there was this little hippo born very, very early at the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanic Gardens, and she's survived. And if she had been a normal hippo, she probably would have been shipped out to another zoo for breeding. But now she's famous. So you can't ship her to another place, or the people of Cincinnati will throw a fit. Can you bring in another male? We don't know how Fiona and her mom might react to the presence of a strange male. So that's kind of thrown the species survival plan into disarray a little bit. We think of managing animals. They keep careful records of who mates with who and what happens to those progeny, because they don't want the gene pool of a captive species to become very, very small. Think about monarchs in Europe. And if you were a king or a queen, you were only supposed to marry another king or a queen. You couldn't marry a commoner. And so what happened is they just kept marrying their own cousins and marrying their own cousins and marrying their own cousins. And this caused a lack of genetic diversity and all kinds of health problems. Botanical gardens and arboreta they can have the same issue. So if we look at these trees here, if we take a look at this spirally tree, and there's another one right next door, these little trees that I have circled are exactly the same species as the one on the left-hand side. So that's the wild type and this cultivar that we have. There are about 8 of these cultivars in the entire world. We have a couple of them here at Seacrest, but they cannot be bred from seed. Is it possible that they might accidentally pollinate with the wild type? Yes, and we don't know what the progeny would look like. So how do we preserve the genetics of these? Do we concern ourselves with the possibility of breeding them with the wild type? Do we allow hybrids to grow up? How do we preserve this weirdo, unusual plant? We have some of the same problems that zoos have. This plant right here, this is horsetail rush. This has been around for hundreds of millions of years. It has basically been unchanged. And to show you that it's unchanged, click the link here. There's a fossil of horsetail rush. These fossils have been around for a very, very long time. The plant looks almost exactly the same. So it survived, very much like sharks have survived unchanged. Right? Natural selection works when the organism produces more offspring than are capable of surviving. In other words, not every offspring is going to survive. The offspring must differ a little bit. Maybe one's a little faster, one's a little slower, one's a little stronger. Think of the differences that humans have. And you have to have differential survival rates, meaning not every number of babies will survive every time a litter happens. This can cause problems. These are Hawaiian silver swords, and this is a plant that's struggling right now. It's struggling because the climate is different now than it was when these plants first arrived on the Hawaiian Islands millions of years ago. And the climate is wetter there than they're used to, and so these plants are actually moving higher and higher up the mountains where it's drier and drier. So this is something that's happening even as we speak. These plants are adapting or trying to adapt to the changes that are occurring. Speciation is the creation of a new species. It can happen when you have interbreeding in nature, and then the hybrids are fertile. So maybe you have this species of maple and that species of maple, and they they hybridize together, and the individuals actually survive and are fertile. And when they reproduce, you get more like them rather than more like the parents again. Mutations can cause reproductive barriers. For example, if the flower color of a plant randomly is different, insects might not recognize that. Or a different insect recognizes only that flower color, and so it's only pollinating that flower color. We more correctly say that they evolve into new species. This usually happens over thousands or even millions of years. It can happen quickly if the species arise in a new place. Say a random seed blows to a new location and happens to survive. Or if a lake develops, preventing reproduction between plants on one side of the lake and the other side of the lake. We look at two types of speciation, basically. We're going to simplify this down to two types. Say, for example, an organism arrives on an island, say the island of Australia. That's why Australia has so many really weird or cool things. Or the Galapagos Islands. So we know that when Darwin arrived to the Galapagos Islands, he was looking at these finches. And all of these finches originally came from a small group of finches that arrived on the Galapagos Islands, and we're not really sure when, thousands and thousands of years ago. And each finch slowly became a new species of finch as they adapted to the area on those islands where they survived. So these changes are a result of new conditions. And if the changed organism cannot reproduce with the original organism, it is by definition a new species. The other type of evolution that we see is convergent evolution. This means that you've got the same phenotype, so in this case these two plants look very, very similar, but they're completely unrelated. There is a cactus on the left-hand side and a euphorbia on the right-hand side, but they look very similar. They're both round, they both look like they have these spiky things, but they're not at all that related. But their environments are similar, which means that to adapt to that environment, you have to have similar features. Can happen again. Here's another cactus. This time the cactus is on the right and the euphorbia is on the left, but they look very similar. They're branched, they look spiny, they have very similar ridges, and that is because their climates and where they live are very, very similar. So, in summary, I'm not here to ask you to remember what the difference between convergent and divergent evolution, but to more broadly note that the genetic things that we've been talking about in the last few weeks, between artificial selection, domestication, mutations, genetic engineering, all these sorts of things can cause enough changes in a gene pool to create new species. Recognize that as organisms adapt to their environment, they can, over time, be changed themselves. So the process of adaptation or evolution can create new species.